Did you know that Pokemon Ruby, Sapphire, and Emerald speedrunners will avoid grabbing the Master Ball just to save time on catching legendary Pokemon? The odds of catching a Rayquaza in Generation 3 with a single Pokeball at full HP is a 0.4% chance of success. But why go this far to save time when the odds are so low? Well, just like that question, the world of Pokemon Ruby, Sapphire, and Emerald speedruns are complicated. The difference between Ruby, Sapphire, and Emerald are drastic enough to warrant leaderboard splits. But between Ruby and Sapphire, Sapphire becomes the favored game to speedrun due to the destruction Kyogre brings to the table. Many have theorized that it might even be slower to use Groudon and Ruby compared to just skipping it, but not many folks have actually ran the game, so the mystery still stands. For those new to the Hoenn region, Ruby, Sapphire, and Emerald start by being stuffed in the back of a moving van, saving the professor from a rampaging wild Pokemon, picking your starter, then having the world open up to you once you've beaten your rival in a battle. Along the way, you'll meet main characters such as Wally, your rival, your father who's never home, and the evil villains of the game. These villains will be completely different between Ruby and Sapphire. In Sapphire, it'll be Team Aqua who wants to flood the planet, and Pokemon Ruby will be Team Magma who wants to expand the land. But in Emerald, you'll experience both evil teams to some capacity. As you move things forward in all three games, you'll earn gym badges, cross the sea to new lands, and confront Team Aqua and Magma as they awaken their respective box art legendaries. So in typical Pokemon fashion, it'll be up to our 10-year-old protagonist to save the day by beating up the villains and stopping those monstrous legendaries from destroying the world. Then you'll go right back to gym badge collecting, obliterating the Elite Four, and finally the champion to beat the game. And once the Hall of Fame screen fades to black, that's where the any percent glitchless category ends in all three games. So what does skipping Master Balls have to do with any of this? Well, it has to do with the legendary Pokemon in each game. But those legendaries are only a small part of the game we have to play to optimally beat Sapphire and Emerald as fast as possible. We start by picking the girl in both games, since the rival fights are less of a pain when you play as the girl. And once we're in front of the bag, it's time for the first of 6 RNG manipulations we have to do in these games. For both Sapphire and Emerald, the fastest starter Pokemon is Mudkip. Its dual type evolution lends so well to these games, since there's only a few Pokemon that have a super effective move for it in the main story. And it also just hits way harder than the other two starters, making it the clear choice for speedrunning. But before we pick up our Mudkip, we'll have to RNG manipulate it. RNG manipulation in Generation 3 Pokemon games are harder than most RNG manipulations due to the games running at 60 FPS. Generation 4 and beyond were made at a 30 frames per second, making them easier to perform a manipulation. And to make things even harder than Generation 4 manipulations, Gen 3's Overworld RNG and Battle RNG are tied together, instead of separated like Generation 4 is. This becomes a problem due to Battle RNG advancing twice the speed it normally does when compared to Overworld RNG, making manipulations inside a battle equal to 120 frames per second, which means the frame window needs to be expanded to be a humanly viable manipulation. The goal we'll be trying to reach with this Mudkip manipulation are a total of 4 different things we want to see a successful outcome on. The first is an enemy Zigzagoon with low enough stats to die to 2 tackles. The second is a Mudkip with good enough stats to beat the game as fast as possible. The third is a forced tackle from Zigzagoon instead of Growl. And the last is 0 encounters all the way from the lab in Little Root to your rival on Route 103. In total, there are about 5 A presses you must get past in order to achieve all these goals. And while this is all complicated, this only scratches the surface of complications with speedrunning Emerald and Sapphire. But what's not complicated is subscribing to the channel if you're enjoying the content and want more cool Pokemon speedrunning videos. Let's talk about the first gym in the game. Roxanne, the gym leader, will be a breeze, but the fights before her will be handled differently for each game. Pokemon Emerald has to brute force these rock-type Pokemon trainers with Mud Slap before it learns its first water move, but Sapphire uses Wingull instead? Very weird, I know, but it's because of how Emerald handles double battles compared to Sapphire. Sapphire requires you to physically talk to Pokemon trainers to trigger a double battle, but Emerald forces you into one if you have more than one Pokemon in your party and step into their vision. This makes Sapphire a prime candidate for Wingull manipulation. Wingull has access to Water Gun early on and can be taught Fly much later into the game. And with the slow Mudslap animation effects, it becomes faster to use Water Gun with Wingull in battle than it is to Mudslap with Mudkip. In fact, catching Wingull would be faster in Emerald if you could avoid double battles with multiple Pokemon in your party. And while you could theoretically deposit Wingull in Petalburg, that would ruin the potential of the next Pokemon RNG manipulation exclusive to Emerald. When arriving in Petalburg for the first time, we'll enter and exit the Pokemon Center in order to have a nice teleport spot for later, which is after we take care of Roxanne, the evil villain grunt, and some Devon Corporation business. But stacked in between all of this is one of the most complicated manipulations ever created. Once you've defeated Roxanne and gone above the gym, you'll see the Aqua Grunt running off with the Devon Corporation goods. You can then save and reset right below the Devon Corp guy, then time your continue the game input precisely with a 4 out of 60 frame window manipulation. This 4 frame manipulation gets you 0 encounters, forces all spinning trainers to move in a direction that is favorable to you, and if done precisely enough, you'll immediately come across a Taillow and a Great Ball at full HP. But after the Taillow is where the big problem with this manipulation occurs. Through some very precise movements, we can force an Abra to fill in the final link of the chain manipulation through a series of audio cues from the battle music. We can then turn a 27% chance of successful capture into a guaranteed one, snagging us not only a flyer for later, but a teleporter we can immediately use after rescuing Briny and his Wingull to skip a giant travel section from Rustboro to Petalburg. And I cannot stress enough how insane this manipulation is and how crazy Amoeba UK was for developing it in the span of 6 days. But this traveling isn't the only one we skip, because Emerald has the luxury of skipping Brawly to fight for later, as it's a much harder fight to handle early on. Sapphire, however, must deal with this here and now, but not before manipulating an Abra of their own inside of Dewford Cave. This is due to Abra not spawning in the same place as Emerald, making it less viable to do a chain manipulation like Emerald does. And after all that manipulation, making it to Mauville is now the goal, as that Pokemon Center is the best spot for teleporting to save time on traveling in both Hoenn games. This Pokemon Center will end up saving time on the travel to grab Strength in Rustboro Tunnel, the journey from Meteor Falls to Fall Arbor Town, the trip to see your father in Petalburg City after beating Flannery, the path from Petalburg to Mauville as you're making your way to Fortree City, and then the final teleport has us go inside the Fortree City Pokemon Center, which we'll take advantage of after biking through Route 120 and Route 121, straight into Lily Cove for a fly point, into Mount Pyre for a boss fight, then a teleport back to the city in order to make Winona's fight a bit easier. That last section I just explained easily has some of the coolest movement in a Pokemon speedrun. But nothing is quite as awesome as a perfectly executed trip through Sky Pillar or the Cave of Origin. This is where a monstrous Kyogre or Rayquaza will be waiting for us, depending on the game that we're playing. Before this trip, however, both games will have to go through the Team Aqua base, where you can receive a free Master Ball if you so choose. This trip takes a decent chunk of time, but by taking it, we miss out on one of the craziest manipulations ever created, and that is the YOLO Ball manipulation for Rayquaza and Kyogre. Much like the other RNG manipulations, we'll save and reset in front of the legendary Pokemon in order to land on 3 separate instances of RNG. The first RNG instance is to guarantee good stats and natures on the legendary. The second instance is when you go inside the bag, while the third instance is pressing A on using the Pokeball. These all need to be timed separately, because of the fact that when you're inside the bag, the game will now be running at the same frame rate as the one in the overworld. And since Rayquaza is less than 1% to get in the ball, it'll take an insane 26 seconds for a human viable frame window to show up. There are technically faster catch frames you could go for, like a 1 frame catch or a 2 frame catch, but it just isn't worth it for that level of inconsistency this far into the game. You may also be wondering why we don't use Ultra or Quick Balls to make this easier to deal with. Well, the unfortunate reality is that it doesn't actually make the catch frame windows any better or faster. It just lines up to be worth it to use a Pokeball at full HP instead of any other ball. But for Kyogre, it's different since they draw upon different RNG frames. In fact, it's actually harder to manipulate Kyogre than it is Rayquaza. Not only is the window for manipulating stats smaller, but so is the catch window for a netball, because instead of a 4-frame window, it's now a 3-frame window. But luckily, this catch will show up at a much faster rate than Emerald. Here's more footage from Wave Warrior, who holds the record in both Sapphire and Emerald, and is very close to Twitch partnership. Check out his channel if you haven't already.
It felt pretty good. That should definitely be in the 3-frame window for stats. If I were to guess, hasty leaning closer to mild than calm. That felt pretty good. Okay. Yes! Okay.
Everything you just saw is for the sake of speed, since Rayquaza and Kyogre will now dominate the rest of the game, making Pokemon Sapphire and Emerald one of the most complicated Pokemon games for RNG manipulation. Special thanks to Amoeba UK for sitting with me to explain the RNG, and Wave Warrior for the awesome speedrunning footage. Be sure to check them both out and subscribe to me if you want to see more Pokemon speedrunning content.